All right, so here I'm going to show you guys a time lapse of how I drew this chicken from the reference on the left side. So I started with my simple shapes, right? And I started with the tail. Remember that it kind of follows that same shape, right? We already set the structure, so I'm just adding in the details and adding in the smaller shapes that are inside of that triangle. Sorry about the glare, but as I mentioned before, right, these feathers are very abstract, right? They're kind of looping like moon, crescent-shaped moon type things later on top of each other. If you aren't necessarily confident in what you're drawing, then you can always refer to the shapes that are already in the reference image. Um, in terms of placement and size, though, remember, not super important, right? So that's why I kind of just like fill up that triangle with those shapes. I add in the back of the chicken, this like behind area right here with the same feathers because that's what I see on the reference. But notice that my feathers are pretty big compared to the small feathers in the reference image. Then I move on to the wing, right? So this wing, I see this large circular shape right here. So I actually divide let me wind it back. Actually divide the wing into these two shapes, right? This circular piece and then this smaller triangle, just like here, this circular piece and this triangle. Okay, so I add in the feathers on the inside of that small triangle, and then I start to add in these feathers of this big circle. And remember in a previous lesson, I had mentioned that if you want to create a different looking texture, then you have to draw a different looking leaves, right? For the tree lesson, right? The same thing applies here. The feathers that are on the top of this circle or in this top circle area look softer than the feathers here, right? Because they're a different shape. They're a different shape of texture, right? So that's why I have these different types of feathers or these different shapes of feathers in my drawing, right? I don't want to just copy this same shape into this part of uh, the wing, or it will look, or you won't be able to differentiate between the wing and like its butt feathers. Okay, so continuing on, moving on to the torso. So my the torso is a little bit larger than what I have in the triangle there, so I kind of make it puff outwards a little more, right? So if you notice here on the reference, it curves outwards. I add in that curve. Moving on to the legs or these thigh areas, right? The thighs are a little rounded as well, so I add that roundness in there as well as some of the feathers to create that soft, pillowy texture. Moving on to the neck, I see some of these pillowy curves as well, and I add that in. The neck, the back of the neck here needs to be has this like bulge, so I wanted to make sure I captured that as well. That's why I erased the original triangle. I'm using it as a guide still, but I erased the majority of it. Sorry, the glare is kind of blocking it. And I move on to the head here, right? All those little details in the head. This is the time when I want to approach it, right? So let's actually wind it back to when it was just a triangle, right? I added in this little gizzard thing, right? And then I added in that crown at the top of its head. Just following like I start with the general shape of it, and then I break that general shape into smaller details. You'll see that in a second, right? Add in the cheek, add in the eyes. All of these small little shapes are little details. Um, Again, they're so close together. The proportions, since they're kind of abstract, they don't necessarily have to match exactly, but try your best since some of the shapes are just circles. Okay, so I finished adding in the texture of the feathers in the chest, and now I move on to the crown. This is a very abstract shape, so it doesn't necessarily have to be perfect. It just needs to look kind of similar, right? And that's why I just counted the number of peaks, right? Like there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 peaks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 peaks on my drawing as well. Okay, and then I move on to the feet. Those triangles aren't triangles in the reference image. They're like little smaller talons, right? So I break it apart using lines to separate the individual talons. adding those curves as well to the different, like, I guess, fingers. Yeah, these are also abstract, so if they're kind of off, like, who cares? No one's gonna notice. And that's pretty much it. So there's my refined chicken, right? I want to point out the differences in the textures here. Okay, the texture of the neck, right, is the softest, right? It has the smallest feathers, almost like fur, right? If you look here, it's almost like fur, right? In the reference. And then if we go into this wing area, you have bigger but rounder feathers, creating a different texture. These are smaller but round textures, and these are sharp but long feathers, creating another texture, right? So the whole idea of this chicken being able to see the different parts comes from the different textures that you apply to this these different shapes.